it's great to see you all here. You're not in little boxes. I'm not in a little box. We've got bodies and everything. That's wonderful. I better play the presentation, hadn't I? That actually helps. Oh, there we go. Living in interesting times. Yeah. Andy always asks me to do these things about once every couple of years, and I sort of think, what's gone on in the last year? And then I realized that there was this huge gap. And quite a lot has happened in the intervening 3 years since we last met in person. And I hadn't a clue where to begin with all this, where to begin with what's been going on in the world, what's been happening. Because it seems like so much is accelerating, so much is speeding up. There seems to be so much more, as Terence McKenna called it around the idea of 2012 and the sort of the end of the Mayan calendar, he called it the ingression of novelty. This idea that sort of new things will be coming at us, bang, 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 faster and faster and faster. And it certainly seems to be the case, doesn't it? That, in our lives, there's more and more sort of pressures, more and more issues that seem to be coming to the fore. And they're relentless. There's just a few of them here that we can look at. We've had, the obvious one, we've had COVID, we've had refugee crises, we've had, the fall of Kabul and Afghanistan and the kind of the interplay of all these different sort of forces that are going on. And of course in England we've had the whole sort of Partygate scandal and the political turmoil that's going on. And the sense that I have certainly is that it's kind of building us into this ever more confrontational space. We're being asked to choose sides. We're being asked to sort of decide what's right, what's wrong, where we lie on all these issues, where we sit with these things. And there's an increased polarization happening. And with that comes an increased pressure, an increased confusion, I think, about what is truth. How do we define truth? We've got the war in Ukraine going on at the moment, and I've heard people sort of talking about it, saying, Russia's, if the QAnon sort of supporters, that Russia's just taking down the kind of the deep state that's based in Ukraine, and almost like it's a good thing. And there are, I think to myself, there are people dying, there is destruction going on a huge scale. But equally, we're being fed the lies, the line that sort of Putin is this monster, that he's sort of demonic. We've kind of actually sort of projected all of this onto him. And I'll be talking a bit more about that later on. And the reality is more subtle than that. It takes a while to get that one. You need to look at it. But I love it because it sort of just speaks to this idea of us kind of fighting over the same thing, essentially. But in this world, we're sort of constantly looking for solutions to all of these problems. And social media kind of amplifies that as well. It sort of puts us into our own little bubbles. We're kind of in an echo chamber of having our own kind of point of view reflected back to us all the time. So we're increasingly sort of bolstered in our sort of preconceptions around ideas. And the problem with that is, I rather like this quote: there are no simple solutions, there are no neat solutions to these things. So we end up kind of going a bit crazy on it all. I think that the rise in stress in our society, the rise in sort of mental health issues, can be attributed to just the complexity of the world that we live in, and how we're supposed to even tackle some of these sort of seemingly, unsolvable problems. Certainly within the current paradigm of our world, it seems like, there is no solution to the climate change issue, whatever you happen to believe that to be. There is no sort of solution to sort of rampant capitalism and the kind of neoliberalism that sort of seems to be sweeping across the world. There seems to be little solution to the rise of increasingly right-wing tendencies within countries and within populations. So one of the things that I've been increasingly interested in as my sort of own personal journey has kind of moved forward is sort of modes of personal development. And I'm very fortunate to live with a therapist. So we kind of, my partner Nicola is a therapist, and so we talk a lot about sort of therapy and personal development. There's never a dull moment over the kind of the dinner table, certainly. And one of the areas that I've been increasingly interested in is parts work. Some of you might have come across this. It's also known as voice dialogue. It's a sort of a therapeutic technique that was developed by Hal and Cedra Stone in the sort of 70s, and it's become increasingly sort of more and more powerful and more and more popular, and it's very powerful in its inception. What it basically sort of is sort of posited on is this idea that all of us have parts within ourselves. All of us have differing aspects in our psyches. And you can see just a few of them here. You know, we bring these parts of ourselves out at differing times. You know, we could have an extrovert part that loves to party. We could have a kind of an introverted part that likes to be alone, that likes to be sort of, you know, much more solo. And these interweaving parts in our psyche kind of play a part in our lives. There's all sorts of differing ones. You know, we're all kind of different. We're all kind of made up of these differing parts. There's no sort of one size fits all in all of this. And you can see some of the ideas here. And the other thing with these parts is that they can also have a sort of a negative effect on our lives as well. The one that sort of is often cited is the inner critic. You know, most of us are aware of having an inner critic. Most of us are aware of having a little voice that sort of nags at the back of your head and says, you're not good enough, or you aren't sort of capable. I know I've got one that sort of shouts at me when I'm about to come up on stage here and goes, what have you got to say for yourself? Why do people want to listen to you, you know? So these parts of ourselves all kind of exist below the level of our consciousness until you start to bring them out by doing parts work, by having a sort of facilitated journey with somebody to kind of explore these sort of areas of your own psyche. And when we do that, we realize that actually we aren't the part. Because when we're in one of these parts, if we're in our inner critic fully, it can feel like that's all there is for us. It can feel like, you know, that's our entirety. But by doing parts work, by exploring, we kind of realize that actually no, because if we can see the part, if we can get in touch with the part, then there must be an observer. There must be what we would call an integrated whole, if you like, that can actually relate to that part, but isn't that part. Does that make sense? Yeah? But one of the interesting things that I find really fascinating about this sort of the notion of parts work is the selves, the parts of ourselves that are disowned. Okay, these are ones that sort of aren't really accessible in the immediate kind of field of our psyches. And quite often what causes them to be disowned is some kind of trauma or some kind of negative event around an expression. So for instance, a lot of people might have parts within their psyche that they're aware of, the kind of the young, playful side, the wiser adult side, the kind of, I don't know, the suave, sophisticate. But the disowned parts can exist within the shadow of our psyches. We're just not aware of them. Yeah, quite often they're to do with anger or fear or sexuality, things that get repressed at quite an early age and that aren't acceptable. And what's interesting about these disowned parts, one of the ways that people who are practitioners of voice dialogue talk about finding them is if you meet somebody that really pisses you off, that really gets your goat, chances are that might be a disowned part that's within you. So you meet somebody at a party that's gregarious and you just think, oh, they go on and on and on. They're really loud. They're kind of like, and you find that really overbearing and you have a very kind of like, poof, reaction against that. It could be because the part of you that wants to be gregarious, that would love to have that kind of holding court energy, that's been repressed. That's not allowed to come out. So when we see it in other people, it's kind of like a dark mirror that reflects that back to ourselves, but we're not really conscious of it. I really like this quote from Ken Wilber, and we'll be talking a little bit more about Ken Wilber a bit later on. There are two major consequences of shadow projection, and this is what happens basically when these parts get activated. We project them out onto the outside world. First, you feel you completely lack the projected impulse. I'm not angry. I don't get angry. I'd never feel angry. Okay? It's not part of who I am. And second, it appears to exist out there in the environment, usually in other people. The self is made less and the not self is made more. Okay? So we're kind of losing touch with what's going on really within us because it's very deep down and buried, and actually projecting it out onto the environment around us, and we see it in other people. Does this resonate? Can you sort of think about sort of areas in your life where this kind of thing might happen? But as uncomfortable as this may be, a person who is projecting will vigorously defend his mistaken view of reality. For it's the utmost importance that the individual prove his projections are really out there threatening him. I think that's really fundamental because I think we've seen an awful lot of that going on over the last few years. Whatever the rights and wrongs of any sort of situation might be, whether it's a geopolitical one, whether it's our stance on kind of things like the pandemic or anything like that, there's an entrenchment that can occur within people's psyches, if you like, and a kind of doubling down on what must be right. And I think one of the problems with that is that it actually then stops us from being able to take a more holistic view, to be able to sort of actually have dialogue, to be able to, if you like, just see the world from a different perspective. One of the things that got me wondering with all of this, sort of looking into parts, well, if our own psyches can have disowned parts, I'm wondering if a national psyche can have disowned parts. Well, I'm wondering whether humanity as a whole can have disowned parts. Things that live in the shadows that don't get spoken about. And for me, I think that's really true, and we see it playing out a lot at the moment, especially with a lot of the kind of the rise of populism within politics and things like that. If you take Britain, for example, our nation, we have this myth that's increasingly coming back into the zeitgeist at the moment. I've seen it a lot in the media, and our dear leaders have been sort of calling on it an awful lot. The myth of empire, the myth of Great Britain, the myth of Britannia, the Blitz spirit, all of these things that we kind of, they're tropes that we're sold constantly, that we're sort of supposed to draw on and dig deep. And it happened in the pandemic as well. We were sort of going out on a Thursday night and clapping all the NHS and, oh, don't get me started on that. That stuck in my craw. This government are dismantling it piece by piece underneath us like a Jenga match, and it's going to collapse eventually. And we're all going out there going, yay, great, But it's this myth that we're being sold. It's this kind of false image of who we are. Because, underneath it all, it was based on slavery. A lot of our wealth of the empire was based on the subjugation of peoples. It was based on an incredible cruelty, that middle lino cuts from the Irish famine, the so-called potato famine, where basically we left people to die. And And not that long ago, we were kind of, one hand, welcoming people of the Windrush generation, but on the other hand, signs like this existed. Even those of you who can't see it, it's no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. It's also a famous book by Johnny Rotten, as his autobiography's title. But, that's the shadow side of this myth. And we never talk about it. We never really address it. And so we get very, very defensive when people start talking about issues like racism, institutionalized racism in the Met Police and things like that, because we don't want to look at the source of all of those things, where it comes from. That essentially, the things that made Britain great, the things that we built this empire on, were racist ideologies, were, almost one could argue that they're genocidal as well. And certainly when we move on to America in a minute, that's sort of part and parcel of that. And those of you of a certain age might remember this. This was a famous sketch on a satirical show called That Was the Week That Was. And John Cleese is the upper class, and Ronnie Barker's the middle class, and Ronnie Corbett's the working class. And John Cleese looks down on the middle class because he's upper class and he has innate breeding. Ronnie Barker looks up to the upper class because, he's somebody to aspire to. He's got everything, but he looks down on the working class. And the reason why I'm including this slide is really because of a sense that this still exists. One of the things I kept on boring Nicola with over the course of the last few months is my exasperation at the political situation in this country. What would it take for Boris Johnson to actually be forced out of Parliament? If he was caught red-handed snorting cocaine off a hooker's back, would that have been enough? I'm not sure it would have done. There was sort of like this kind of meek acquiescence, a shoulder shrug, collectively. It was like, oh, well, there he goes again, good old Bojo, he's just fathered another child illegitimately, or whatever it happens to be. And I can't get my head around, I sort of say, regardless of your political kind of viewpoint, there's a bit of me that just thinks, how can these people be voted in? And if you look at the kind of people we've got about to take his place, because it finally got too much, but it was too much. Well, yeah, anyway, I'm not going to go into that. I need to get off my soapbox. But I think that's another aspect of the shadow of the psyche of this country, is that we are servile to people that have long been our masters. I'm not going to say betters than masters, but that, have long been our masters. And that civility, that kind of sense of doffing our caps meekly, while those in power kind of do whatever they will do and get away with it. There's a long history of it. The Prince Regent was a notorious one for something like that. It's been going on for years, and it will probably ever be thus until we have some kind of revolution in the way we govern things. I don't mean a literal revolution, although there might be arguments for that. So these kind of elements exist within our society, and I don't think we give them enough credence. I don't think we look at them enough. One of the things Andy mentioned is, I do work for television production. I'm a freelancer, so I'm not working for any one particular person. I do stuff for the BBC. I do stuff for all sorts of people. But the BBC in particular has been sort of castigated for years as a hotbed of left-wing intellectuals. It's a lefty thing, and actually, when you look at the makeup of the BBC now, ever since the Hutton Report, which some of you will know is to do with the sort of dodgy dossier on Iraq, it's been progressively sort of moved towards the right in terms of who's been in there, positions of power, positions of authority, to the extent that the current Director General is a friend of Boris Johnson's and a major contributor. So this myth that it's kind of, some sort of left-wing hotbed is actually not true. But it's touted as being sort of, the kind of the creme de la creme of media in terms of getting the truth. Of course it's not the truth. It's one particular version of the truth as presented by and filtered through a lens of the people that happen to work there and the people who are pulling their strings and in power. Just as Russia today is the equivalent with the different sort of hat on. So it's incumbent on us, this is a little tangent I'm going off on here, but I think one of the things that it's incumbent on us to do is to really sort of be selective with how we consume media, how we understand what we're being fed, and to not take it all at face value, because the truth is always obscured by other vested interests, I think, and it's very hard to get a sense of truth. Moving on, we look into America, that's another thing with the mythology of America, the kind of Wild West, the sort of settlers, the frontier spirit, the kind of the maverick, the kind of and the heroes of war, there's a lot of mythology around that is kind of being portrayed, especially with Trump. I mean, it's lessened now that Joe Biden's in power, but it's still there. It's still there, the sort of salutation of the flag and that kind of almost worship of this American myth. But once again, the shadow is far, far more serious. America was essentially founded or certainly sort of settled by the genocidal wiping out of the indigenous peoples. They didn't exist. They were just there to be got rid of, basically, in the grab for land and resources and power. You could argue the same's happened in Australia as well. That cartoon, incidentally, that you probably can't see the caption on it. That cartoon was from 1908, I believe, and the caption just says peace. So even back then, this idea of military expansionism, military might being, all, that was being satirized back then. This is nothing new. This is something that's very sort of common to us. And obviously the wall that Trump wanted to build to keep people out, this kind of push-pull of isolationism, so that on the one hand there's expansionism through military might, and on the other hand there's isolationism. We don't want brown people coming here and taking our jobs. These are the sort of contradictions that we're dealing with when we actually start to look underneath what's presented on the surface and is really, really brought to the fore. So this sense of individually and collectively dealing with shadows, I think, is really, really important. And I've talked about this in the past. It's a thematic thing for me, but I think it's always worth coming back to in this, especially in this setting, because a lot of what we talk about here is about expanding consciousness, is about kind of getting a bigger, broader view on things. For those of you who might find it difficult to read, why is shadow work important? Because when we haven't done it, we're arguing our position from a place of fear and projection. We're unable to remain in a calm center. Instead, we see our enemy and the threat to us they represent. But they're not really the enemy at all. They're merely pointing to the unintegrated selves inside that we disown. Okay? Let that sink for a little bit. One of the other areas that I've been looking at over the last few years, last 6 months in particular, Nicola and I did a course in integral relationship therapy, which was hosted by the chap on the left, a guy called Martin Ucik, who is a student of Ken Wilber. Any of you familiar with Ken Wilber's oeuvre and work here? So some of you have, yeah. He's kind of one of these figures that sort of not a lot of people have heard of, but he's I think incredibly influential in his thinking. And basically in the 70s, he kind of started to work on what he called this integral theory, which was basically a kind of a meta theory that encompasses pretty much everything. Encompasses sort of science, arts, metaphysics, all sorts of religious sort of ideas, and tries to bring them under one umbrella. He's incredibly prolific and has been working on this. He's still alive today and is still sort of churning out a lot of work. And it's not without his critics, but I think there are some really interesting ideas in here. And like I say, it's amazingly complex. I'm only starting just to sort of scratch the surface a little bit of some of it. But one of the things that really interests me with his work is that one of the central tenets of it is different stages of consciousness that we individually and collectively pass through in our development as beings, essentially. And these stages of consciousness, they're not like a kind of computer game where you sort of go up onto the next level and you're just in that world. The way we sort of move through them is that... Oh, has that not changed? There we go. And don't worry about the stages yet, because I'm going to go through those in a minute, because I think they're interesting to sort of think about. The way we move through them is that we kind of, in any given stage that we're in, as the complexity and the challenges of our lives increase, we kind of hit a brick wall where the qualities of that stage can no longer serve us, where the kind of the answers that might be on offer to us from that particular perspective don't work anymore. And so then transformation sort of happens, and we kind of pop into the next stage. And it's not like there's any kind of specific work that needs to be done. His theory doesn't prescribe any particular type of learning or thing that you must do in order to achieve enlightenment. It's not around that. It's more just looking at how these stages kind of impact us and how we move through them. Whether you choose to do, kind of, I don't know, Buddhist meditation or kind of yoga or whatever modality you want to expand your consciousness, it's fine. Okay. So as we move through each stage, the idea is that there's a sort of, we take on the skills of that stage, we develop, and we integrate them into our psyches. And it's rather like a ladder, but it's not a perfect ladder. It's not a ladder that we climb up. Like I say, it's not a computer game where we go up onto the next stage and that happens to be our entire world. It's more that it's an imperfect ladder with holes in the rungs that we kind of leak through from different levels. So what are these levels? Well, there are more levels than this in his model. These are just the sort of the main ones that kind of really affect us in our day-to-day lives. And to be honest, archaic doesn't really kind of affect us that much, but this is to do with our basic survival instincts, our sort of fight or flight, our kill or be killed. That's kind of the very basic sort of mechanism of survival. And for each stage, and again, I'm abridging this massively, there's a far more complex kind of view of it than this. There are qualities of each stage and there are limitations of each stage. So in the archaic stage, the quality is you can live, yay, great. But the limitation of that is much more to do with really not having any awareness. It's such a basic sort of life urge that the notion of past and future is non-existent. And we don't really have an interior in that. It's quite animalistic in that sense. And as I'm reading these out and going through them, I think it's really worth... When I had this happen to me when we were on this course, and Martin, the kind of guy running it, was going through these, there were bits of me thinking, oh yeah, I see that. I see that in aspects of myself. I see that in aspects of people around me. I see it in aspects of society and community on a local level, wider society, all of that kind of thing. So it's really interesting to sort of, when you're going through these, to think about how these things resonate in your life, how they actually make you feel. The magic stage, which each of the stages has a colour, by the way, so people that are really into integral will just go, hey man, that's really amber, or that's really orange, you're being really orange now. So the magic stage, this is the sort of to do with deep bonding of groups. This is to do with sort of feeling in community. It's to do with the sort of the tribe, if you like, and cooperation. It's very much to do with sort of collectiveness. Collectivity may be better. But along with that goes the limitations of it, which is to do with you can't really be an individual. You can't really stand out in that, because the needs of the collective, the needs of the tribe, the needs of your family, the needs of the kind of settlement, whatever it happens to be in that situation, trump your own personal individuality. And alongside that comes what Wilbur would call a false belief in magic. So the idea of superstition, the idea of kind of the nature realms, if you like, kind of, I'm being careful here because a lot of these things are sort of areas that I do believe in. So I'm not sure I agree with the false belief in magic. Maybe I would say an over-reliance instead of a false belief. But yeah, superstition, it's kind of, and you see that quite a lot in a tribal setting, that there can be this very superstitious worldview. And then we move to the egocentric, the red thing. I know a lot of people who are in this one. Qualities and capacities. This is to do with drive. This is to do with power, independence, creativity, spontaneity. It's like the expression of our individual life force. So whereas the previous one was to do with the collective, this is much more to do with us as individuals and how we express into the world, how we create. But the downside of it, it's all about me. It's all about, this is where it's at. You lot don't matter. This is where it's at. Okay. And again, your mileage may vary, as the Americans would say, but I think, I can see areas within people's lives where they can be very much like this. I can see areas in my own life where I can be a bit like this. And I can see areas of society that are often like this. This would be, I suppose, epitomized in like the kind of the Thatcherite era. I'm all right, Jack. The kind of go out and get there. It's the Gordon Gekko of, Wall Street and that kind of avaricious sort of wanting everything. Moving to the next one. The mythic stage. Some of these colours are debatable. Some people will call the mythic stage blue, but the sources I have say that it's amber. And this is, I think, where we really start to sort of get into societal manifestations of this as much as they are on the individual. Blue is about stability, amber is about stability. It's about order, purpose, rules, loyalty. So the police, institutions like government institutions, the civil service, the monarchy, they would really fall into this in terms of where they would sort of psychically sit within this model. It's very moralistic. It has a very clear set of rules. Basically, all religion falls within this sphere as well. And it's very much sort of honouring of past events and sort of looking to the future as well. So it's projecting out from where you are at the moment. And I guess the continuity of those rules, it's very unchanging and a bit unflexible. The continuity of those rules is the most important thing. You know, doesn't like change really. Only one right way. And the marginalisation of non-conformists, I think, is a really interesting negative side of this. And we can see that again playing out at the moment. It's interesting around here, if you kind of live around this area, you'll notice how the sort of bollards have been erected on various streets around Glastonbury to stop people parking their vans and sort of sleeping in their vans overnight. And we know that Priti Patel's kind of pushing through this kind of law to try and make it illegal, basically. You know, so there's this sort of, any of us in society who are viewed as non-conformists in this sort of stage of development are being shunned, are being marginalised, are being trying to sort of force out of existence. Something that is very, very worrying, I think, and very worth fighting against and trying to guard, that right to be non-conformist. Because actually, you being here, you're non-conformists. You might not know it, but you are, because you've come to an alternative conference with alternative views, many of which might be seen as being taboo, and certainly not within the orthodoxy of received wisdom and allowed thought that is starting to happen in this country very much at the moment. And it's inflexible and it's rigid and it's patriarchal. And again, we see this playing out on the world stage, you know, things like the overturning of Roe v. Wade in America, you know, and kind of women's rights seemingly being rolled back decades. This sort of patriarchal view of the Supreme Court knowing what's best for people. So I think this is kind of a bit of a key stage that we're at the moment for many of our institutions and many of our societies. And then we move to the rational stage, orange. And this is kind of like I'm not going to say it's a counterpoint to it, but it runs alongside in certain ways, that the qualities of objectivity, so science sits in this stage. The kind of, the lauding of science above all else, you know, the sort of the idea of rationality, that science has all the answers. And along with that, the sort of sense that we can make progress by using science, the sense that we can have it all if we only apply our objectivity and our rationality to things, that we can create democracy that's perfect, that we can create freedom for all. And of course, is that true? Can we really do that? It's rational, it's cold, it's calculating. It's driven by status and success. Little consideration for the environment. Is this ringing any bells? I'm kind of feeling that it does at the moment for me, in terms of where we're at as a society. The two, the amber and the orange, are very much to the fore at the moment, I think. You know, and we've got this battle going on between those of us who want to sort of work towards a more ecological, more fair, more kind of equitable future, and the kind of the rampant capitalism that is dragging us back and wants to hold on to power and cling on to it. And a lot of those people that want a brighter future, want sort of something that's more equitable, want something that's sort of looking after the planet, they might be seen as losers from this particular perspective. You know, certainly not winners, because they're not go-getting and they're not actually kind of contributing in the way that a good life for all, liberty, happiness, democracy. This next one's an interesting one. Some would say this is very Glastonbury. The pluralistic, the green level. This is about far more emotionally based kind of responses to things. It's about equality, sensitivity, compassion. It's very holistic, it's non-judgmental, it doesn't make judgments around people. Except when you go, yeah, you're really, really red. It's celebrating the feminine. It's to do with all of those things that celebrate the feminine, the goddess. But the limitations of this view are, I think, again, you know, I've kind of come across this quite a lot. I won't read those out, you can see it, but certainly the elevation of the goddess above the masculine, rather than it being in balance. I think that occurs quite a lot in some of the circles in the New Age movement, that we kind of, and the goddess, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that shouldn't be the case, that the goddess is venerated and worshipped and lost my words, and pay tribute to. But if we do it at the expense of the divine masculine as well, we end up with an imbalance. We end up with a kind of society that's sort of tipping one way, rather than actually sort of having a sense of balance and order that works. New Age narcissism, that's a contentious one, but all too apparent sometimes. And what I want to say about these levels is that one of the interesting things in the Wilber's model is that all of the levels below that line, if you're in one of those levels and your center of gravity is in them, because we're not in any one level. As I said before, it's not like a computer game where we're kind of just in one level and then we kind of evolve to the next level. We occupy within our psyches all of these levels within us. But below this line, we kind of don't realize that. Below this line, we think where we're at, where our center of gravity is at, where our main kind of psychic sense is at, that's all there is, yeah? So people that are kind of would be in this model very much in the mythic stage, because they're sort of very, very, very religious. They kind of, you know, their religion, their faith is everything to them. They can't see that there could be a sort of potential other way around that. Or if they do see it, there's a kind of grudging acceptance of it, but there isn't a real kind of acceptance that they could be wrong and that there could be a different way of looking at it. Yeah, does that make sense? This. Can you get the sense of that sort of? So all of these stages here are very much to do with kind of a singularity of view, if you like. And we might have glimpses of the other things, but there's not the sort of comfort that's there from being in one particular bubble, if you like. So moving on to what Wilber calls the integral stage. And this is where things really start to change a little bit, because all of a sudden we're recognizing the importance of all of the other stages in our development. All of a sudden we have an overview and we suddenly think, right, okay, these things have value. They're not to be shunned, they're not to be kind of pushed away. that everything that preceded it has equal value. Yeah? Doesn't force own values onto others. Knowledge and competency supersede rank. God, we could do with that now, couldn't we? Some knowledgeable, competent people who are actually in power. You know. Because when you look at the sort of political situation in this country and well across the world, quite often you think, where are they? Where are these sort of people operating from? Their centre of gravity's around here somewhere, the egocentric. Yeah? They haven't got a higher picture. They've got a sense of, I just want to fill my pockets. I just want to make life as good as I can for me. I want power. I don't see that many politicians certainly in our society, who really have a sense of a wider vision and a wider viewpoint. There are a few of them around, but they're few and far between, and they often don't have a voice. And as well, with all of these stages, there are limitations. Can be cold, calculating, bit opportunistic, manipulative, arrogant, analytical. It's not to say that everybody has these, but we all have the potential for the good and the bad, if you like, if you want to call them that. And then we move to the transpersonal. So this is really about kind of like transcending a lot of these stages and actually really fully embracing all that is, okay? Wilbur describes it as being tantric. Tantra is about the acceptance of everything. And there's deep wisdom is inherent in this. There's a kind of a knowing, a gnosis, a knowledge. And a real sense of how as a race, as a species, humanity is evolving, humanity is waking up, humanity is actually opening up its consciousness and on a journey of opening up its consciousness. And it serves universal goals. So this is about something much wider than ourselves. It's about something which is sort of much more to do with our place in the universe, if you like. Our place and our relationship towards God, whatever you perceive that to be. Our relationship of the journey that we're on in this human form, whether it's one time round, whether it's many times round, that this level is about the value of that journey and how can I contribute to it? How can I play my part in that journey? How can I play my role? Yeah? And I want to re-emphasize this idea that actually all of these levels are available to us within this model. All of these levels are accessible to us. We might have what Wilbur calls a center of gravity, where we kind of mainly hang out. Interestingly enough for me, when I heard this, I realized that I think I've got a center of gravity that's sort of biased towards green. Because one of the things that when I heard about this thing, this sort of model, was that's a hierarchy. I don't like hierarchies. That sounds really unequal to me. You know, they're kind of stratifying people. And the idea is actually that it's not about that. That's a green thing to think. It was one of the sort of negative points of the green spectrum was that we don't like hierarchies. We want everyone to be equal. We don't want sort of, there to be. But of course we're not. In real life, there are hierarchies. There are hierarchies of knowledge. There are hierarchies of expertise. I know far more about video editing than most of you do, but you will all know far more about whatever your specialism is than I will. Yeah? We're constantly dealing with difference and a sense of hierarchy. But certainly for me, the idea of sort of thinking, okay, yeah, I think I probably hang out in green a bit, but I can see bits in my psyche that kind of like tradition and like kind of rules and like things, so that's a bit amber, and we're all made up of this spectrum, if you like. We all draw upon different parts of it according to the stresses in our lives, according to sort of where we are on our own personal journey. And that, for me, is one of the beauties of this system. And I'm presenting it really just as a sort of a way of inviting discussion and inviting thought and inviting ideas around this. I'm not some sort of huge advocate of this as being the be-all and end-all of everything. It is but one way of looking at society, looking at ourselves and our relationship to society. It's one way of kind of, I guess, codifying in a way that kind of makes sense to me. It might not do the same for you, but I think it's very much worth reflecting on how we relate within something like this model to ourselves and how we relate to society. So, why am I presenting all of this? Why am I talking about this? The sense that I have is that we tend to view spiritual development, we tend to view our own personal development. And when I say spiritual development, I'm kind of leaving that as a very loose definition. It is what you want it to be. It could be our psychological development if you're not into spirituality. But it's the sense of how we develop our inner world and how we develop our own psychic map, if you want to call it that, of the world. And quite often, it's predicated on expansion, it's predicated on upward movement, it's predicated on this rather than this. We want to get out of our bodies, We want to transcend, slip the surly bonds of earth, to transcend life in all of its sort of slightly mucky, complex, and often challenging reality. And certainly, those of us who are interested in New Age beliefs and New Age thought, whatever that is nowadays, can often ignore the kind of the grit that makes the pearl, because we want to actually move out of our bodies. And I've said this a number of times when I've talked, but it's a saying that I keep on coming back to. It's almost like a touchstone of mine, that we are human beings we're not human beings having a spiritual experience, we're spiritual beings having a human experience. We're meant to fully be here. We're meant to fully live our lives to the best of our ability in all its messy glory. And the shadow work that we undertake, the way we delve into those sort of like more challenging parts of our own lives and our own beliefs and our own preconceptions, the more we can come to terms with them. We're not trying to transcend them in the sense of leaving them all behind, bypassing them. I don't believe that works, because it puts us on a shaky foundation. And we're too easily wobbled by the vicissitudes of life. We're too easily knocked over because we don't have that firm foundation of embodiment, of really being who we are and accepting of who we are, with compassion, with love, essentially. Yeah? Because the foundation isn't really there. Whereas if we actually take the time to look at our shadow, to actually kind of come to terms with our relationship with it and foster a good relationship with it, both on an individual level and a societal level, then we can really start to affect change. It's like, a tree that has no roots, and actually what we need to do is make sure the roots are strong, because that's when we can actually really start to grow. And by undertaking this kind of work, by really kind of committing to sort of delving down deep into our own psyches and to refining that relationship, I guess, then we can actually start to affect real change. Because part of the problem that we have at the moment, I think, is that everything's just too big. The kind of the problems that we're facing as a society are massive, and we can't tackle them on their own. And I certainly, when I see the news and I see everything that's going on, there's a bit of me that just wants to switch off, put on the nice elevator music, scroll through social media, which Nicola will tell you I do far too much anyway, but that's another story, and just numb out. Huxley famously wrote in Brave New World, of this idea that we would all be happy and we would all be kind of having our daily doses or weekly doses of soma to keep us, numb but happy. And we know that this is sort of coming down the line to us. If you look at sort of the World Economic Forum and the idea of the Great Reset and, you will own nothing and be happy. God, there's something seductive about that in a weird kind of way. Wouldn't it be nice not to have any effort? Wouldn't it be nice not to be struggling all the time? Wouldn't it be nice to know that your needs are met and that actually we could just play? But what price does that come at? And that's maybe an idea for another talk. So, I'm going to wrap up now and just say I hope that what I've presented to you gives you some food for thought, which is really all it is. It's food for thought, it's food for exploration. We're going to have a weekend of all sorts of differing ideas that are going to be presented to you. And they are all going to be food for thought and food for mental exploration of the psyche. Take all of them with a pinch of salt and believe in all of them totally. Thank you.